My name is Paul Henry, Security and Forensic Analyst at Lumension. Welcome to our Patch Tuesday update for February 2013. Well, it's going to be a rough Valentine's Day for many IT admins this month. With the ongoing issues with Java and 12 bulletins from Microsoft, including 5 critical issues and, of course, many restarts, it's going to be a very disruptive Patch Tuesday. It's disturbing to note how many different Microsoft platforms are critically impacted this month. Everything from Windows XP to the new Windows RT is critically impacted. It's never a good sign when your current code base, I should say, is impacted. There are also a lot more bulletins this month than we've seen in the last few months. We noted back in December that 2012 brought more consistency and stability to Patch Tuesday than we saw in 2011. We hope that this month is a one-time spike and not a return to the yo-yo patterns of 2011. Now let's look at some of the details. Specifically, we're going to look at them in priority order. MS-1310 is a vector markup language remote code execution vulnerability, though it seems like an Internet Explorer bulletin at first glance. Vector markup language is always parsed by the browser, which is why it affects all versions of IE. Unfortunately, this also means there's no real way to reduce or mitigate the risk of this vulnerability without applying the patch. Therefore, this is the highest priority, bulletin for this month. Now, MS-1309, it's a critical remote code execution issue. It addresses 13 CVEs, which is one of the larger number of IE CVEs that Microsoft has addressed in a single bulletin, though it's by no means the biggest. Though it doesn't look good, it's actually a fairly typical IE issue. In the spring, we tend to see higher IE patches as Microsoft cleans the browser up. Fortunately, none of these CVEs are currently under active attack. MS-13020 is an update to OLEA, that's the Object Linking and Embedded Automation. The impact of this bulletin is limited, only affecting XP Service Pack 3. However, this should be a very high priority for XP users as this does have remote code execution capability. Risk is mitigated slightly because authentication is required for execution, hence it's really not a wormable type of exploit. The primary vector for attack through this vulnerability would be parsing RTF files in an email through OLEA. MS-13011 is a media decompression issue that could allow for remote code execution. This doesn't affect any of the newer platforms, fortunately. It's a pretty standard media player direct show vulnerability. The worst case scenario would be an end user browsing to a website with a codec that leverages the content the website is playing and it uses direct show to render that content. MS-13012 is an outside-in update for Exchange. There are essentially 2 of these updates this month, one of course for SharePoint we'll discuss later, and this one for Exchange. This is a critical remote code execution issue and should also be a high priority. MS-13015 is an elevation of privilege issue with .NET. We've seen previous updates to .NET in which a lot has changed. This one doesn't change much. The bulletin is critical, but fortunately it's not under active attack. MS-13016 is a vulnerability in kernel mode drivers. Looking at this bulletin specifically, it addresses 30 CVEs and may look a little scary. However, it's really less horrendous than it looks at first glance. All the vulnerabilities addressed here are contained within a single component. However, different functions within that same component all have the same vulnerability. Microsoft could have chosen to mark this as a single CVE, but has chosen to present each individual change as a different CVE. This does affect all versions of Windows from XP to Windows 8. MS-13013 is an important update adjusting remote code execution in the Fast Search for SharePoint 2010. Microsoft has issued Fast Search updates in the past, and this one is more limited than those have been historically. It only affects the advanced filter pack. This again is an outside-in issue that I referenced earlier. MS-13014 fixes a vulnerability in Microsoft Server that could allow a denial of service attack. This issue affects the handling of file operations such as file share. Now, the network file system NFS role is not enabled by default, so the update is only offered to server systems that have the NFS share role enabled. MS13017 is a regular kernel update for an elevation of privilege issue that impacts 3 CVEs. It affects all versions of Windows and is pretty similar to your typical kernel updates. MS13018 fixes a TCP vulnerability that could allow a denial of service attack. Now, ironically, it's very similar to the half-open, SYN flood attacks that we've seen over the last decade. Again, what's really interesting here is instead of using that initial SYN packet, leaving the connection half open, you're using a TCP FIN packet, but you're not completing that FIN handshake to end that connection. So again, you can consume resources in doing this and fill that table on the target server and cause the denial of service attack. MS13019 is an elevation of privilege vulnerability in CSRSS. That's your Windows Client Server Runtime System. It corrects a single CVE issue and is really limited to a small number of Windows platforms. It has to do with how CSRSS handles objects in memory. Now, on Thursday, Microsoft also issued an advisory and a patch for Flash, as did Adobe, to patch a vulnerability that was being exploited in the wild. For Microsoft users, this is Flash on Windows 8. Now, however, it's all Flash products from Adobe. We'd recommend you install these Flash patches as soon as possible, as it is under active attack. Issues outside of Microsoft. The bigger issue, of course, probably is Java, yet again. Oracle has received some pretty consistent negative attention for the problems with Java over the last few months. Just a couple of weekends ago, they issued patches for over 50 CVEs, and we have yet more patches coming in the next couple of weeks. Then for the second time in the past month, Apple literally killed Java accessibility for their users. No notification was provided whatsoever. This caused significant disruption to productivity for those Apple users with Java. Again, I would guess that a large number of Apple users do in fact use Java for those websites that require it. A day or two worth of notice would have been smart, giving users time to find alternative arrangements for their Java running applications. Now, this shutdown was a departure from previous Apple policy. In the past, Apple would include Java patches within their own patches and push it out to their users. Now, when a problem occurs, they abruptly blacklist Java, causing productivity disruptions for their users. Fortunately, users can re-enable Java by going directly to the source and applying the patch issued by Oracle, re-enabling then Java on the Apple machines. Now, Mozilla has also shut off auto-loading of plugins like Java for Firefox users. While this is less disruptive than Apple blacklisting, it would still be best for patches to automatically be applied through the application. Java isn't necessarily really an enterprise software concern. It's primarily at the desktop level. For concerns at that level, automatic patching is definitely best. I personally hope this is a wake-up call for Oracle and their developers. People are rapidly approaching the end of the rope with Java, and they are seeking alternatives. HTML5 is looking like a promising frontrunner. Though it will certainly have its own share of issues, its newer code, etc., we hope that these issues will be fewer and further between. Many organizations, including the Department of Homeland Security, have recommended that people simply disable Java completely. While this would certainly be a good way to prevent issues on your machine, it may not simply be realistic. Many applications run on Java, and users would quickly become frustrated when those applications no longer work. It really is difficult to just walk away from Java. So, while we wait for a realistic option like HTML5 to gain some steam, remember it's always best to apply a vendor's most current version of their software. It typically is the most secure version of that software. I'd also like to note an issue with Intel. It's very reminiscent of the infamous ping of death attack. There's a bug in an Intel Ethernet controller that's vulnerable to this new packet of death attack. If put to malicious use, this bug could crash network systems, even those protected by a firewall. A fix is currently in the works, but not yet available. This has been our Patch Tuesday update for February 2013. Thank you for listening.